All right, welcome everyone to my channel. This is the Arcade Amigo, and just here on a Friday night, just kind of chilling a bit. I'll be drinking a beer here off screen, just trying to relax after a long week of work, and been going through Final Fantasy VI, and this is one of my favorite games of all time, um, and just wanted to talk about it a bit. This is the Pixel remaster version on the that I have here for the Switch. Um, it's interesting because this game, I played it back when it first came out back in 1994. So this would have been around the fall of 1994. And I was a Sega kid growing up, but I kept hearing so much good things about this game that we had to play it. So, me and my brother, he's a few years older than me. And so we were pretty hardcore into gaming at the time. And again, we were Sega kids. But again, we kept hearing about this game. We grew up a lot with a Game Fan magazine. We would read some other magazines like EGM, Game Pro, and some other miscellaneous ones. But Game Fan, that was like our gaming Bible at the time. And that was part of what really solidified our Sega bias. We already grew up with the Sega because we had the Sega Master System growing up, and then we went over to the Genesis. But then reading Game Fan, that really like validated our love for Sega because they would say they weren't biased, but they they kind of were a little bit towards Sega. But it was cool though because a lot of other magazines weren't at the time. Pretty much everyone was on board with Nintendo, so it was good to get their perspective on it. But even then, though, they would definitely show love to a lot of Nintendo games, and one of the games that they would just really hype up a lot was this one here, Final Fantasy VI. And I remember looking at the screenshots at that time, thinking that the backgrounds looked photorealistic, and they kept talking about the music, how amazing it was, and how this is one of the best in the series, and how it's part three, but it's really part six. And so I had heard about the Final Fantasy games at that point. But again, not having a Super Nintendo or a Nintendo, it wasn't a series that I had played up until that point. And so we were like, we got it. What is this game? Final Fantasy 3, which we knew it at the time. We got to check this out. So a friend of ours, he had the Super Nintendo, and so he would bring it over from time to time. That year, we got to play some great Super Nintendo games. From renting them, it was I remember us playing Super Metroid and then Super Punch Out. We really got into those games, and definitely in the back of my mind, I mean, let's see, this would have been 1994, so I would have been 14 years old. I would have been barely in eighth grade, ninth grade, and so I didn't have my own money at the time. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I was like, man, this Super Nintendo is pretty good. I wanted one for myself. It's just we just could only afford one system in our household at the time, which was a Sega Genesis. So luckily, we had this friend that would come over and bring his Super Nintendo over. Um, and But this game was, you know, there's certain games in my gaming history that really opened up my imagination in such an expansive way, um, that I have really them to thank for so much for a lot of the creativity and imagination that I had back then that I still carry to this day. It started with Fantasy Star and then Govelius and then to an extent The Legend of Zelda. And then as we got into the 16-bit, it was Fantasy Star 2, Sword of Vermilion. Those are the games that I have access to, right? That would really expand my memory, or not my memory, but my imagination. Landstalker, that was another one. Um, Another one was Lunar, Silver Star Story. All amazing games. I still go back to them a lot. They're still some of my top favorite games of all time. But when we played this one, though, it's when immediately within like 10 minutes of playing it, I just thought to myself, I get it now why these Final Fantasy games have been pretty well talked about. And this is before Part 7. Because, see, Part 7 changed a lot. Part 7 made it very mainstream. It, I should say, still within the realm of video games, right? And all, because even when Part 7 came out, it was pretty mainstream and it sold pretty well, but video games were still fairly niche. So you can imagine even before that, right? They were even more niche. And But even then, though, right, for the people that loved RPGs, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest were the games that people would talk about a lot. And so, um, with again, like I said, right within those first few minutes of playing this game, I was like, "Oh my god, this is amazing! The music, the graphics." I immediately started like trying to realize like who does the music on this, right? Which I eventually found out was the legendary Nobuo Uematsu. Um, and I mean, just the song right here that's playing right now, right? Um, it was just blew me away. And you know, basically, I'm going to start off here showing off what I first saw when I played this game. Now, this is the pixel remaster version, so obviously, um, the music in this is different, and then also the graphics are a little bit spruced up a bit. But this more or less gives an idea of what we saw back then. I thought the way it was showing the story here was pretty cool. Like, oh, something happened in the past, but it was a very steampunk kind of aesthetics to it, which we'd have been. Well, I had played the Fantasy Star games, Part 1 and 2, and Part 3 at that point, which had a lot of sci-fi elements to them. Um, but the setting to this one I thought was pretty cool still, and still unique. But back then, I thought that the backdrops to this were pretty. I mean, in my mind, I thought that they did look pretty photorealistic. Um, it was just an impressive use of the Super Nintendo sprite power and also the color palette that they had. The original Super Nintendo version, it was Wedge, I believe, was named Wedge, but Biggs was Vix. Um, it's interesting because the translator to this game, Ted Woolsey, he had a lot of pop culture references in this game. On the original Super Nintendo translation, um, and for whatever reason, he got this name spelling wrong on Biggs, which he spelled it Vix, because Biggs and Wedge is a nod to Star Wars, so basically like a pop culture reference. Um, but they got the translation wrong, so I'm not sure exactly why. I just know that he had a heck of a job translating the Super Nintendo version, he had something like 30 days to translate the whole game, which is pretty insane. Um, but just a little tidbit there on that. But this scene right here, I just thought was amazing. Like just the very slow movement of um, the mechs there, the Magitech armors, um, as they go through the snow. And now this looks a little bit different because again it's a pixel remaster version, but more or less what the Super Nintendo one looked like. And again, just very impressive on how they were using that technique here in this scene right here. Even back then, I thought that the Mode 7 was a little gimmicky. Um, but this, I felt though, it was a good showcase of the technique. I remember looking at this and thinking, kind of trying to think ahead of like, if they can do this in a 16-bit games, what's the next generation going to look like? Like, how are they going to utilize the technology to tell a story? Because what I think is cool about this is so they're slowly trudging through the snow as the ground just slowly kind of scrolls forward, and the background kind of comes into view more. And it was just a cool play on the graphic techniques that they were doing then, um, in how it helps to set a tone to what's going to be going on here. Um, just thought it was pretty well done. Alrighty, so let's see. Alright, so again, I'm just kind of going through a few things here that talk about this game. So I just wanted to see that intro again. I just think it's so cool. But let's see where I'm at in the game right now. It's much further ahead. So this is after the world has ended. So I'm now in I believe it's called the World of Destruction. Um, Has a little bit of loading in this version, but it's not too terribly bad. Once it gets going, it's not too bad. All right, so I just got Edgar into my party here. But right now I have Edgar, Sabin, and Celeste. So let's talk about this a bit. So starting with the graphics, again, just the detail in the background, I just thought was really amazing. If you go back and look at the previous Final Fantasy games, so Final Fantasy 5, 4, and even further back, obviously with the Nintendo ones, and the graphics were colorful, they were nice. Well, the part one, I think it just or part one and two really just had even I think part two just mostly black backgrounds with minimal detail. But 4 and 5, they were nice. They were nice to look at, but it just had more of a bland look to them in the backgrounds. Where this one just really had a lot of detail in them, and I really appreciated that. It just again, it almost gave it like a photorealistic look, in my eyes back in the day. Um, Honestly, when I first saw these sprites, um, I wasn't too impressed with them, and I think it's just because up until this point, I was a huge fan of Fantasy Star, and their sprites. I mean, they're still kind of, I mean, they don't. It's not like they have a whole lot of detail or anything, but I just felt that they were more realistically proportioned, where these sort of looked a little bit more super deformed, almost chibi style, I guess you can say. And it took me a minute to kind of grow into them. Now I just find them. I just really like them now. I love the pixel work on them, and especially in this one because they added a lot of little animations to them, like when they're going through the story. That their emotions and all give a good expression of what they're trying to convey and what's going on in the story. Um, I thought that was pretty good. It's pretty cool how they did it on this one. But the portraits here I thought were pretty cool. Again, this is where I started getting introduced to who the people behind Final Fantasy were. Um, I might get his name wrong, but Yoshitaka Amano, I think, is the name of the artist that would do a lot of the artwork for Final Fantasy through up to 1 through 6, where he was the main character designer. After that, they changed mainly to Tetsuya Nomura and a few others. But up until this point, he was the main. Amano was the main one doing the artwork on these. And another thing too that I just thought was interesting was he has a very, I don't know what's the word, like almost ethereal, mystical style to his character designs that just evoke a certain tone to the game, and along with Uematsu's score, and it just gave the Final Fantasy games back then a certain style that I really like. Um, but yeah, even the detail on the towns, like in these here, how there are some of the buildings are destroyed and all. Just really nice sprite work done on this, and again, the usage of color and all. That was pretty amazing. And one other thing too that was really cool was the spell effects too. Again, this version has the spell effects are enhanced, um, but even on the Super Nintendo, they look pretty nice. Nope, killed it pretty easily there. Now I'm just kind of cruising through this game now. I have some of the boosts set up on to get more experience and all. Um, these days um, I have just more limited time to play games. So if it's a game that I've already beaten before in the past, I just want to relive it. Sometimes I will add some cheats on there and all, just because I just want to go through it and experience the story. I'm not worried too much about challenging myself on it and all, just because um, when I want to experience something again. Certain games I want to experience with the gameplay. A game like this, so I would just kind of want to go through the story mainly. Maybe find some hidden stuff that I didn't before. Find, but the overworld, though, with the graphics again, right? Pretty impressive at the time. Uh, I can't think of a game that had done it like this before in that time frame. So it was pretty cool to see, right? The scaling and rotation on the overworld map. Again, good usage of the Mode 7. Um, there it is. Um, yeah, it was pretty impressive back then. And this part here in the game is interesting because just a different tone that it takes, right, from the first part of the game being, or the first half, I should say, where it was very more colorful. But now, after Kafka does his thing with the up in the floating continent with the warring triad and ruins the whole world, um, it just kind of takes a very drastic turn. The color palette that they use here, it's just, I mean, it really gives that sense of like defeat almost, right? Like you lost. Um, you're going through this world that's just ruined, almost like it feels like it was your fall. Um, and this is the aftermath of it. Um, and I thought that the way they show that with the color palette that they use, I thought was pretty impressive. But yeah, I mean, visually, definitely one of the best looking games of that generation. Definitely on the Super Nintendo. Um, just a just a nice looking game. Um, it's definitely aged pretty well. The enemy designs too also look really nice too. The only thing is um, the animation on the enemies. I mean, they barely have any, so it's a little feels a little archaic. But other than that, the detail to them are really well done. And another thing I wanted to talk about too also is the just the music to it. I mean, again, Ubu Amatsu. This was my first introduction to Final Fantasy, and even to this day, this is probably my favorite soundtrack from him. Probably my favorite soundtrack in a Final Fantasy game. That I don't know. I'd have to think about that actually, but if not my first, probably my second or my third. I mean, it's just stunning. Um, a lot of variety in it. The battle theme is really catchy, which is good because you're going to hear it quite a bit. Um, the overworld themes are probably some of my favorite. The first one, before the world goes to, gets destroyed. I think it's called Terra's theme. Um, just one of the most beautifulest songs I've heard in a game. And then this one here, when you're in the world of destruction, how it's just very somber like and all. And I mean, it just kind of feels highly depressing almost, but that's what they're trying to convey in this part of the game. So it definitely does its job as far as that goes. And of course, the classic victory fanfare theme. I'm gonna change it back to the original version. I mean, this is like pretty much what the Super Nintendo sounded like. I always like that sound effect of the wind in the background. Yeah, Super Nintendo, when it came to symphonic kind of soundtracks, it was just that's where I felt it really excelled. And again, this game is one of the best for that. Um, the sound effects are fine, they do their job. Nothing too fancy, but they did their job. As far as for the playability of it, um, it's it's interesting because this game, it I mean, there's characters that are definitely more of the main characters than others. Um, like for example, I feel like these three are, they definitely take a big spotlight in the story. But then there's also Tara, and then she's probably, at least in the first half of the game, I feel like she was kind of the lead character. But then you get to the second half, and it's kind of Celeste. But that's what's cool about it, though, is that it's not necessarily one main character. All of them have their moments, and I thought that was cool. But the other cool thing, aside from how they play in the story, is also the gameplay. So, for example, Edgar has these cool variety of tools he can use. Sabin, who's probably my favorite character, is he can you do like Street Fighter commands, so you can do some pretty powerful moves. Um, Celeste has really powerful magic, and she has this ability called Runic, where she can absorb magic too. And the other cool thing too, also, is as the story goes along, you get these espers, which you can equip to your character. Now, let's see, he hasn't looked Fenrir yet. Okay, so I can go ahead and add Fenrir to him since Seven's already learned all his magic. Let's see. And let's have her learn Shiva. And so the espers themselves, they have some pretty powerful attacks or abilities that you can use on screen. And back then, it was pretty visually impressive to see they're called espers in this one, but really it's like the summon spells of Final Fantasy. Let's do Shiva here. Um, and so I thought this was pretty impressive back then. And actually, in this Pixel Remaster version too, because the spell effects and all just look pretty cool. But like, let's see, let's do Fenrir. No, oh, okay, not quite what I was expecting, but sure, that'll work. But the other cool thing though is that as you equip these espers to your character, they give you magic abilities. And once you learn the ability, you stay with that ability, even if you switch to a different esper, which I thought was pretty cool. And the other cool thing that I liked about it too is not only how it fits into the gameplay mechanics of it, where it just kind of gives you a variety of how you want to customize your characters. Because each of them are going to have a special ability, and then whatever espers you want to give them so that they can learn those magic spells too. Um, but I just thought it was cool how it plays into the story too, right? Um, with how important the espers are to the story on it. I thought that was just pretty cool. I like when games do that, where certain mechanics of the game kind of correlate with what's going on in the story. A few games pull it off really well, and I think this is one of them that did it pretty well. And so, speaking of that, I mean, that's the main draw to this game for me. That keeps me coming back to it. It's just a story. Um, just a quick synopsis of it. You start off the game as Tara, who I don't have her in my party right now, but she has these magic abilities, and the Empire seems to be using her for that. But she gets involved with a group of people, including Edgar and Sabin here, that are part of what's called the Returners. Um, Ultimately, out to try to stop the Emperor, which is the mainly the Emperor Gastal, who seems to be like the main bad guy. But then you're also introduced to Kefka, who just seems to be kind of his subordinate. But he well, he does some pretty crappy stuff, and you end up finding out that he is actually and is going to be the main bad guy as he betrays his emperor, and it's just kind of psychotic. Um, Kind of think of him as a medieval fantasy Joker. I mean, that was some pretty crazy magic powers, um, and so I mean, the guy's so psychotic that ultimately, because of him, is why the world is like the way it is now. Just his lust for power causes him to basically revive these warring triads, where if they're moved out of balance, it corrupts the whole world and basically destroys it. Um, and so now that's why the world looks like the way it does, as he sits in the tower, um, basically shooting like a ray of light to burn whoever opposes him. So it's just like this whole world lives in fear now of this crazy ass clown. Um, and it was crazy is that when that happens, when the world is destroyed, it's like you lost. It's you rarely see that in games that you lose to that extent. Because eventually in the game, you are able to gather your party together, and then you end up beating him. But he still destroyed the world. So then it becomes more of a story of just trying to find your purpose again in this apocalyptic world. And what I thought was interesting about it too, which I just thought it was so impressive back then, and even now, is it almost feels like two games in one, because the first half of the game, the story's moving along, it's fairly linear, um, it's going one direction. Again, you're thinking that by the time you get to the floating continent, it kind of feels like the last dungeon, the last boss, right? Um, but it isn't. It's really only about halfway through the game, give or take. Um, and so then that happens, and so now you're in this area here, and this part of the game, you could follow like a set path, and it kind of guides you along, kind of right to where to go to, but it is a lot more open ended. And a lot of the things that happen in this section of the game, or I should say, a lot of the things that there is to do, you can miss a lot of it and still beat the game. So it's a lot more open ended like that, which I thought was cool because I think I've heard some things that some people didn't quite like that, but I did. I think it's cool because it just it kind of twists the game a bit and keeps it fresh, um, and gameplay wise, and then also what's going on in the story. I just thought was pretty impressive. I mean, it just blew my mind when I was a kid, and so maybe a lot of that has to be because of nostalgia, just because I thought it was so unique. But even to this day, I just think it was highly ambitious for its not only for its time, but even then, or even now, I think it's pretty impressive, and also why I think that it's a Final Fantasy that as it's still considered for many people, right, one of their favorites. This. Um, I mean, there's moments in the game that just have stuck with people. Probably one of the main ones is the opera scene. Uh, Man, it was just it was just impressive to see back then. Again, it had like a certain emotion to it, a certain level of production value to it. And I mean, in reality, that opera scene, it's kind of silly why you have to go through that, because you're just trying to get an airship. As Setzler, the the pilot of that airship, is trying to kidnap the singer Maria, and so Celeste is just standing in for her because she looks alike. Um, and so the whole thing is just kind of silly, but just the production value to it, the music that plays on that scene and all, it's just stuff that you wouldn't see back then. And there were certain games in the 16-bit era, kind of later towards the later part of the 16-bit era. Like I'll take this one, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Snatcher, Lunar, the Silver Star story, and to an extent the sequel Lunar 2. Um, there's probably some other ones that I just can't quite think of right now, but they're just games that the way they were telling their stories, they were really trying to do something more mature, more expansive, more imaginative. That I remember thinking, if they're doing this now with 16-bit, because we were starting to see a glimpse of like 32-bit, the fifth generation, and so it was just I remember it would have just drive my imagination crazy. Like what's next? How much further can they push this medium of gaming? And well, we've all, if you've been following games for a while, right? Obviously, they did a lot of impressive things, but there was a lot of foundation that was built during this time that I just think was just really cool, and I'm just glad that I got to see it, right? As gaming matured, right, to where it's at right now. Um, but these games are still, they're still really fun. They're still really well done, and definitely still worth coming back to. Oh, let's get a chocobo. But yeah, I mean, story wise, definitely one of my favorite games for that of all time. Um, there was for the first part of for the first several Final Fantasy games that came out. Um, it kind of seemed like what they were doing was they would take one game that was kind of more gameplay focused. So, for example, part one, part three, part five, you could customize your characters. And so, give them different job classes. I mean, part one was pretty basic on that, but then part three expanded that more. And then part five really expanded it on it even more. But the stories were a little light, whereas even numbered ones, so like part two, part four, and part six, seemed to have more of a focus on story. From what I've heard, I think it was just the way it just kind of happened to be as they were making the games, right? And then the developers that were available next, right, to make the game, it just happened to go that way. I don't think it was something that they were trying to do intentionally. But it's just interesting that that's the way it ended up panning out. But yeah, such a memorable game. Um, I mean, really, I can't really think, the only knock I guess I could have against it is that the random encounters can be quite a bit. Um, this version is kind of nice to play, again, as I'm kind of playing it just more casually, is because you can do the auto battle thing, which speeds up the battles, and then just kind of, you can just turn your mind off a little bit as you, like if you're just watching something in the background while you play this, makes the grinding just a lot better. But in the original version, the random encounters can be a bit of a pain. Um, in the original one, the translation, again, in some parts seemed a little hokey. Again, the translator that was in charge of it at the time was given a crazy task to get this game translated in such a short period of time, and he had to condense a lot of the text also. So I'm wondering if maybe that had to do something why he chose to make like certain pop culture references and all. I'm not sure. But even then, I mean, you still got the gist of the story and all. It's just that playing the original one with some of the mistranslations or the just the nature of the translation and all. It's not my favorite version to play through, but this one right here, the Pixel Remaster, the translation pretty well done, um, and uh, um, and it doesn't have like all those kind of pop culture references. So for me personally, from what I've been experiencing, this one's probably it is my favorite one version, or wait, I should say, to play in this game. And I mean, the other thing is just the soundtrack to these Pixel remasters are just so well done. So it's actually been a big joy playing through this game with the symphonic soundtrack. I've kind of changed it up a fair bit, right? So you can hear the different versions. Um, but yeah, I mean, so much good things to say about this game. Um, I owe it a lot for what it did to my imagination, what it did to just my love for gaming in general, for what it did to also, really want me to branch out to experience other game systems. I'd already really appreciated a lot of what Nintendo was doing, and I wanted a Super Nintendo. But when this game came out, I was like, I need to get this at some point, and it wasn't until much later that I was actually able to buy it. But it was just one of those things, right? That I was like, I need to have this to own. Um, and But yeah, so I have a few different versions of it. So again, this is the Pixel Remaster. Um, I recently got this here. So it's the Super Famicom Final Fantasy VI cartridge. Just a cartridge by itself. Um, a little crusty there at the bottom, but I bought it at a used local game store here in my area. Um, I don't have the Super Famicom. There's a few games that I have been wanting to get physically again, and this one here, they just happen to have it there, so I just wanted to grab it right away. Um, but definitely, just like having it, right? Just kind of more of a collector's thing. Um, but yeah, just cool to have, just because I love this game so much. But yeah, but that's mainly all I have for this one here. Just wanted to share some thoughts on it. I was just doing a bit of grinding in it right now. Um, but yeah, I mean, if it's a game you for some reason have never played and you're into RPGs and all, or just like experiencing things from to get a bit of a video game history, definitely check it out. The Pixel Remaster, I mean, it's you can buy it pretty much anywhere on the PlayStation, Xbox, Switch, Steam, so it's pretty easily accessible. This would be the version to get, I would say, unless you're a hardcore collector, right, and you want to try to search for the Super Nintendo one. Um, it also came out on the Game Boy Advance. That version there, it's pretty good. The music is, the Game Boy Advance, just the sound chip to it was different, so the soundtrack is it's different. It's not as good as the Super Nintendo one, but it's not bad though. And But does have some new content to it. So it's nice to have that version too. And you can also get it on the Android and Apple Store as well too. So like I said, it's available pretty much anywhere. But yeah, definitely recommend it if you have any interest in like RPGs, Final Fantasy games, old school games, good story, anything of that sort. Definitely a must play. It's not too hard of a game, even if you don't have like the boosters turned on. That gives you like extra experience points and all. It's still not that too hard of a game. Um, and yeah, just a classic. Definitely for me, one of the all-time greats.